Hey folks, it's the Youth Climate Podcast team, and this is our third episode. In the last one, we talked about what we can do as an individual to help the environment on a daily basis. Today, instead, we will explore what the youth strikes like Fridays for Future and school strikes for climate are demanding of the governments. Even if individual actions can reduce the CO2 emissions, it is crucial that the governments take a step to reduce global warming on a bigger scale, and especially that the government meets the 1.5 Paris Agreement. We've tried to cover as many countries as possible to show how the different requests can be. But of course, we weren't able to cover all states, so if your country is missing and you know what you're asking your government, please write us a mail so we can talk about it in the next episode. Before digging into this week's topic, we will start as usually with our news section. We hope you enjoy!
Episode 3, News Section. In an effort to reduce the waste created by non-recyclable coffee cups and landfills, a new startup based in New York has developed an innovative design grown as fruit on a tree. The company, which goes by the name of Creme, has engineered gourds so they grow within the 3D printed molds that form the cups in the correct shape. Once picked, the coffee cups are good to go. Following its new trend towards implementing environmentally conscious laws and measures, the UK government has voted to ban all plastic straws, stirrers, and cotton buds from 2020 onwards. Having seen in polls an overwhelming support of 80% of the population wanting these changes, it becomes clear to lawmakers where popular opinion lay, thus driving the motion into action. A study by German think tank Autonomy has shown that European countries, including Germany, the UK, and Sweden, all need to reduce the length of their working week if they wish to combat climate change. Measures of carbon outputs by working citizens of these three countries indicated that maintaining the present work hours will prevent these nations from reaching the Paris Agreement goals. Data analysis has conclusively shown that the big pharmaceutical industry produces more greenhouse gas emissions than the automotive industry does per $1 million revenue. This amazing find shines light on a sector previously undisturbed by concerns of environmental impact, revealing that less than a quarter of these large corporations keep a consistent tally of such emissions. Farmers in the central United States are struggling to go as rising temperatures and natural disasters bottleneck the growing season of their crops. This pressure on the agricultural sector may well have huge effects on the nation's economy in years to come, and it brings into question the need for better crop insurance measures. In a first for science, a young albino panda has been photographed in the Sichuan province, China. A single picture was taken by a camera trap in this region sometimes over a month ago. However, the find itself has only been recently announced by authorities. Thousands of tufted puffins are believed to have perished off the coast of Alaska as rising global temperatures shrink their food supplies. It seems that these adult birds died in the process of molting, during which additional strain would have been placed upon this population. Malaysia's last male Sumatran rhino has passed away in captivity. The individual, who was named Tam, was successfully coaxed into breeding with two female survivors. However, no offspring were produced before his death. Now only a single female remains on the island called Iman. A study in Senegal's Nicolo Koba National Park has shown green monkeys behaving with unprecedented mental agility as they learn to adopt an aerial predator alarm in the response to a drone being flown above them. Whilst the vocalizing of these species has been little studied previously, it has been presumed from observations of similar species that alarm calls were a fixed asset, which has disproved this finding. In another piece of coffee-related innovation, a Californian startup is developing a reusable coffee cup product that can be planted instead of discarded, with seeds of beneficial native plants layered into the biodegradable material. Dubbing themselves Reduce, Reuse, Grow, the project has launched a Kickstarter campaign to provide funding for distribution.
This is all from the news section this week. Now, we all know about the weekly climate strikes and the asking of the youth to save their future. And especially the strikes are there to wake up the politics. But why is it so important to wake up the politics? If you ask yourself this question, be lucky, we will answer it right now.
Episode 3, Part 1. Why are demands to the government so important? It is important to make demands to the government, as it shows that the youth are not only skipping class to march for climate, but we're also reflecting on the actions the government has taken to solve this crisis we're in. Even though politicians are not yet listening, the repetition of these demands is putting pressure on them, reminding them that we will not abandon our efforts, and that many people on this earth are asking for change. The demands may vary from one country to another, but as you will see in the episode, the idea behind them are very much the same. The change needs to happen now. As this climate crisis will mostly concern us, the younger generation, it makes sense for us to make demands and propose actions that need to be taken to ensure that we will have a future. As the government is not doing anything, it is our duty to push them to accomplish their duty.
This is all from the news section this week. Now, we all know about the weekly climate strikes and the asking of the youth to save their future. And especially the strikes are there to wake up the politics. But why is it so important to wake up the politics? If you ask yourself this question, be lucky, we will answer it right now.
It is important to make demands to the government, as it shows that the youth are not only skipping class to march for climate, but that we are also reflecting on actions the government can take to solve this crisis we are in. Even though politicians are not yet listening, the repetition of these demands is putting pressure on them, reminding them that we will not abandon our efforts, and that many people on this earth are asking for change. The demands may vary from one country to another, but as you will see in this episode, the idea behind them are the same. Change needs to happen now. As this climate crisis will mostly concern us, the younger generation, it makes sense for us to make demands and propose actions that need to be taken to ensure that we will have a future. As the government is not doing anything, it is our duty to push them to accomplish their duty.
Before covering what the different requests all around the world are, we wanted to inform you about the demands which Greta Thunberg started striking. This is important to know since she's the one who brought your youth strikes in first place. So what is that she asked the politics for?
Greta Thunberg's demands. According to Fridays for Future's website, on the 8th of September, Greta decided to continue striking every Friday until the Swedish politics provided a safe pathway well under 2 degrees, in line with the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement aims to limit temperature rise this century at 2 degrees Celsius. As of now, there are 185 countries that have ratified the agreement. For comparison, there are only 195 countries in the world, 196 if you count Taiwan. Unfortunately, many countries aren't actually adhering to the agreement, though a few are. As of October 2018, these countries included Morocco, Gambia, India, and Britain.
Now, let's discover together what the climate strikers from all around the world asked their government. What is their aim while striking, and their thought about how to save their future. Here, it is important to remember that we are not the scientists but the worried youth. It is not our task or job to give the government a finished plan of laws, restrictions, and new solutions. But what we know is which goals need to be reached when in order to save our future, since this is what the science found out. And since we do talk to those experts, we have a good idea of what is necessary to reach. But how it needs to be reached is what the politics need to discuss in every country. It is their job to think about it. And sadly, it seems to be our job to remind them that they need to start now in order to save our future. So here's what we demand to the government around the world.
Fridays for Future Austria demands that leaders take bold action on climate in order to stay within 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming within this century. They demand that preventative measures be taken and say that the youth of Austria will only stop striking when a plan that meets their demands is put in place. They point out that we have to take unprecedented pollution control measures over the next 10 years in order to stop the mass extinction and the climate crisis. If we don't, we'll head at full speed towards an ecological collapse.
Episode 3, Part 2.3, Australia. School Strike for Climate has numerous demands. The demand that the Adani coal mine be stopped, that no new oil, gas, or coal projects be started, and that Australia transfer to 100% renewable energy in accordance with the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. report released in 2018. The Adani coal mine, which the group opposes, is known as the Carmichael coal mine and has been proposed by Adani, a large power business. The coal mine, which would be in Queensland, would be the largest that Australia has ever seen. According to The Guardian, if the mine goes ahead and leads to the development of other mines in the basin, their potential combined maximum input would be more than 705 million tons of CO2 being emitted each year. That's about 1.3 times Australia's total current emissions.
Fridays for Future Brazil is yet another country that demands a Green New Deal. The deal must address the climate crisis as in the case of an emergency, which they feel it is. They want their country and society in general to realize how the severe weather that climate change brings harshly affects countries like Brazil. As one statement by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez says, thousands of Americans died in 9/11 on the worst terror attack on US soil, and agree with the response or not, our response was war with two countries. 3,000 Americans died in Puerto Rico due to Hurricane Maria. Where is our response? They want to reduce the chance of these events by eliminating fossil fuels, pollution, and global warming as much as they possibly can.
Canada. Climate Strike Canada's central demand is the creation of a Green New Deal Canada addressing the climate emergency with the scale that the global crisis requires. The deal should advocate for a quick transition to a 100% renewable economy and at the same time reduce inequality in line with science and indigenous knowledge. Therefore, fossil fuel workers shall be guaranteed a new job in a new economy based on sustainable transportation, and the United Nations Declaration of Indigenous Rights should be respected in full. Youth should have their say in all future plans as the climate crisis endangers mainly their futures. And people forced to abandon their home because of climate change should be recognized and welcomed as refugees. Additionally, the organization asks to legislate a reduction of at least 65% of greenhouse gases emissions by 2030, in order to reach zero emissions by 2040 and to reject all new fossil fuel extractions and transportation. Fossil fuel subsidies are also asked to be eliminated and a tax on pollution introduced.
Youth Strike for Climate England demands 4 main actions. The first one is to save the future. We want the government to declare a climate emergency and implement a Green New Deal to achieve climate justice. The Green New Deal is a set of principles to guide a policy plan that will fundamentally restructure our economy to deliver good jobs and a livable future at the same time. It is now clear that we need a bold and radical plan to fight the climate crisis at the scale considered necessary by scientists. To make this happen, we propose to massively shift the debate on climate change in the UK. Through a high-profile interventionist campaign, GND UK will fundamentally alter both the political and public conversation on climate change. We will shift the conversation away from the small incremental changes currently being demanded and proposed in Westminster. Instead, through a radical intervention, we will create the unstoppable political momentum needed for both a dynamic and creative cross, a government response to climate change. The second request is to teach the future. We ask to reform the national curriculum to address the ecological crisis as an educational priority. This will hopefully get more young people involved. The third demand is to tell the future. The government, indeed, should communicate the severity of the ecological crisis and the necessity to act now to the general public. And finally, we ask to empower the future. We want the government to recognize that young people have the biggest stake in our future, and by incorporating youth views into policy making and by bringing the voting age down to 16.
Friends, as Youth for Climate Friends is a very decentralized movement, there are no national demands that have been put in place yet, but a document containing the national demands is currently being written. Still, many local groups have established a list of demands. In Toulouse, the group is asking the government to respect the climate agreements, such as the Paris Agreement, and to recognize a climate and environmental emergency. Like many other movements, one of their demands is the creation of a citizens' assembly that would work on ecological transition, as it is a way to make our system more democratic and to allow citizens to discuss a subject that concerns each and every one of us. They also have more concrete demands, like banning plastic and electronic billboards, the end of the use of nuclear energy, and the ban of glyphosate, a herbicide, are also on the list. Other requests are to put a tax on kerosene and polluting industries as well as on products that come from globalization, as they could and should have come from local trade. They demand the renovation of all public buildings so that they trend towards energy self-sufficiency. Balance has similar demands but adds some link to food consumption, limiting food waste, and to work on vegetarian alternatives in school canteens. They ask for the protection of insects as well as for regulation concerning fishing and hunting. Concerning transport, they demand urban road tolls as well as the development of public transport by using renewable energy and by reducing the cost or even making them free.
Germany. Fridays for Future Germany calls on the government at local, state, and federal level to declare the climate crisis as just and take immediately actions initiated at all levels. This call is justified with the need to downturn a climate catastrophe, which can only be achieved if action is taken now. To achieve significant improvements across all sectors, fundamental changes must be taking place first. The German Fridays for Future movement claims that, particularly in the sector of energy production, housing and construction, industry, transport, and agriculture, enormous efforts are needed. Fridays for Future demands compromise with the objective of the Paris Agreement and the 1.5 target, and to achieve the goals, they demand to the government to reach the net zero by 2035. What the net zero means is to only produce as many greenhouse gases as can be recycled through natural processes like through plants. Meaning that by 2035, they need to reach the point where they no longer put out more CO2 than can be recycled and causes the planet to warm up. As well, they demand to the government to reach the coal exit by 2030 and to run the country with 100% renewable energy supply by 2035. Crucial for the observations of the 1.5 target is it to reduce the greenhouse gases emission as quickly as possible. Therefore, Fridays for Future Germany demands three things to be done by the end of 2019. The first one is to end the subsidizing of fossil fuel and reduce the coal usage by 25%. Secondly, they would like to place a CO2 tax on all greenhouse gas emissions. Here, it is important to say that the price of the greenhouse gas emission has quickly become as highly as it costs for us and our future generations. According to the UBA, the German Department of Environment, this would be €180 per ton of CO2. The realization of those demands must be made socially acceptable and must by no means be at the expense of the low-income citizens. It is important to note that Fridays for Future Germany does not list the way to reach these demands, since there are many different ways to reach the goals and need to discuss which way will be the right one for Germany. This said, the German government must come up with appropriate plans. Last but not least, it needs to be said that there are a lot of cities in Germany who have local demands. They are adding to the German demands fitting to their city, and can be different from each to each local group. But since they are diverse and fitting to their local needs, it is too much to give an overview here.
The main requests of Fridays for Future Italy are to halve the country's emissions by 2030 and get down to zero emissions by 2050. In order to do so, the organization asks the Italian government to state its views on climate policies more clearly, including to respect the Paris Agreement and to shut down coal-fired power stations by 2025, and responding to politicians that have proposed to use exclusively methane as a source of energy. In terms of the latter, with methane being a fossil fuel, this action wouldn't reduce emissions enough to stop climate change. Additionally, the government has no investment in different kinds of renewable energy or electric cars. Consequently, the movement requests to cut all of the 16 billion incentives currently dedicated to fossil fuels and to stop funding unsustainable farming and breeding. It also demands to invest in public transport and to reformulate taxation in order to promote the use of entirely electric cars and motorbikes. Another request is to log in an eco-friendly way and therefore reduce deforestation for agricultural purposes and to limit its soil consumption. Last but not least, the government should take action to make the existing building more efficient from an energy point of view in order to reduce energy waste and consequently emissions due to energy production. Furthermore, they want the government to plan future construction sites respecting the environment. All of these requests should go alongside a deeper scientific awareness of environmental issues on behalf of all citizens, and therefore with the inclusion of environmental themes and debates in schools.
The fact that Indonesia is the fourth largest CO2 emitter in the world should make us concerned. We're home of the third largest forest in the world. They provide clean air, clean water, food, commodities, prevent flooding and landslides, as well as store carbon. But deforestation takes place at a fast pace. The massive use of coal for electricity and energy has caused residents to suffer from air-polluted related diseases. Palm oil, presented in many everyday products from soap to jam, is often produced through non-environmentally friendly measures. But people always refrain from conserving natural resources due to the assumption of trade-off between economic growth and environmental conservation. The latest study on the low-carbon development from the Indonesia's Ministry of Development Planning, BAPPENAS, however, proves such assumption wrong. The study suggests that Indonesia can grow its economy to 6% per year, larger than the current growth, while slashing the country's greenhouse gas emissions by 43% by 2030, exceeding its emissions reduction goal stated in the NDC. It's entirely possible and profitable to tackle climate change economy-wise. Movements in Indonesia to stand for natural resources and climate change are on the rise, starting from Hutan Itu Indonesia, which spreads positive stories about forest, climate reality projects that educates the public about the reality of climate change and promotes solutions, to Bye Plastic Bags, initiated by teenager sisters that work towards eliminating plastic in Bali. Many prominent individuals have also started to voice their concerns on the ocean, non-eco-friendly lifestyle, the use of non-plastic straws and bags, and more. This has been a promoting start, but the number we have now is not enough. A Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, survey on Indonesian voters suggests that compared to economy and social welfare, environmental issues are not considered urgent. Only 1.63% of the respondents stated that environment was a pressing issue. That said, the World Resources Institute, WRI, survey to 18 to 40-year-old urban residents in Jakarta, Pekanbaru, and Palembang suggests that in terms of knowledge, more than 70% of residents are able to link the impact of climate change on disasters and the degraded quality of life. Those within 31 to 40 years range pay more attention to environmental issues compared to those 18 to 30-year-old, suggesting that more effort must be done to reach out to the youth.
Fridays for Future Ireland demands that the government declares climate as an emergency and act accordingly. As Ireland has already declared a climate emergency, they demand that climate science be mandatory in schools and that the media cover climate extensively. They demand an end to fossil fuel usage, an end to offshore drilling, a plan that would get Ireland to 100% renewable energy by 2030. They ask that Ireland follows suit behind the 10 countries who register ecocide as a crime, particularly if it's committed by corporations. And lastly, they demand that the federal government do everything in their power to meet these standards and protect the future of young people. Youth for Climate Luxembourg asks the European Investment Bank to stop funding fossil fuels and invest instead in durable, long-term solutions to face the climate crisis. The European Investment Bank is located in Luxembourg and is one of the most powerful institutions at a European level operating there. Stopping them from funding fossil fuels would imply a change in policies at the European level and would have a huge impact on the fossil fuels industry. The organisation also requests both their government and the European Union to declare a climate emergency. However, this request has been recently downloaded and therefore dismissed.
New Zealand. School Strike for Climate New Zealand demands the government acknowledge the magnitude of the climate crisis by declaring climate emergency and passing a law supported by all parties consistent of an ambitious Zero Carbon Act. This law should, in the first place, set the aim to have zero carbon emission by 2040 in order to limit global warming to the 1.5 degrees Celsius. since according to the IPCC, achieving such goal would require immediately reduction of emissions. A plan should be issued to halve New Zealand's emissions by 2030. Transition to the zero carbon should be guided by a commission composed of climate experts, which should set short-term emission budgets. Additionally, the government and all big polluters should be legally enforceable if they fail to respect this plan. Currently, if the government fails to meet the target, a court may only issue it by declaring of breach. Consistently, the organization demands concrete consequences against any kind of breach, such as eventually recognition of the Prime Minister or massive investments in the climate change initiative to remedy the harm causes. The methane reduction target should be at least of 47% to encourage an immediate transition of horticulture industry towards a more sustainable development, improving water and soil quality, and increasing biodiversity. As right now, horticulture largely contributes to New Zealand's economy. Investment should be made in other sectors in order to diversity economy. Additionally, the government should cases all new explorations and extraction of all coal and gas, not guaranteeing any extensions to existing permits, and invest in renewable energy productions and in sustainable transport systems. This would imply reducing the need for fossil fuel for transport and the privatization of alternative jobs in clean, sustainable industries for people currently employed in the fossil fuel industry. All of these steps should be achieved through a meaningful partnership with the communities, tangata whenua, and the youth to ensure that no one is left behind during the transition. All action should honor the principle of the Te Tiriti o Wangahai, the treaty insurance to respect of native people, and be integrationally just, so approved by all generations, including the youth.
School Strike for Climate Portugal demands that the government acknowledges the horrible consequences that climate change has in our country, like the drought we've been facing in the south of the country, and the fires that get more and more deadlier each summer. This movement also appeals to the need to shut down power stations in Sines and Pago that still run on coal. To close these stations, it is imperative to create new jobs related to renewable energies. That's another one of their requests. To rely purely on renewable energies by 2030, particularly solar. Also, another ambiguous socialite is to be carbon neutral by 2030 and invest in scientific research to do so. Another priority should also be an efficient management of forests, cleaning and reforestation with autochthonous species to avoid fires. Finally, but not less importantly, the organisation has asked the government to improve the public transport network in the country. Although the reduction of prices took many cars out the streets, many people may still have to use their cars due to the non-existence of public transport that take them to their destination.
Although South Africa is one of the most vulnerable countries to climate change, risking water shortages, extreme weather events as cyclones, floods, and the diffusion of diseases, it is the 14th largest emitter of CO2, as it is still largely relies on fossil fuels. Therefore, Fridays for Future South Africa asks all political parties to acknowledge the climate emergency and to commit to making climate action the priority of 2019 elections. Additionally, the organization asks the commitment to a moratorium on new coal, gas, and oil mining licenses, and the establishment of a Green New Deal for South Africa modeled after the USA one. Last but not least, the electricity sector should provide energy exclusively using renewable resources by 2030, and climate adaptation education should be initiated in all schools.
Fridays for Future Sweden has very similar, if not the same demands that Greta Thunberg has. They would also like Swedish policies to provide a safe pathway well under 2 degrees Celsius, i.e. in line with the Paris Agreement. They would also like, first and foremost, to listen to scientists and researchers as well as to stop warming before 1.5 degrees, and to have all politicians, locally, nationally and internationally, to declare a climate emergency. Their goal is to preserve and manage the planet on a fair and equal grounds for future generations.
Switzerland. Climate Strike Switzerland demands the Swiss government to declare climate emergency, acknowledging the climate crisis as an emergency to face immediately. They ask for concrete actions to reduce greenhouse emissions to zero by 2030, without the employment of alternative technologies which would harm the environment in a different way. They ask companies responsible for the most CO2 emissions to take responsibility for the harm they've caused both in a financial and in a social way. Additionally, according to the organization, if the current economic system provided to be unable to ensure climate justice, then a new change in the system itself would be necessary. Hong Kong. Schools Strike Hong Kong for Climate Action is a group of strikers operating in Hong Kong. Although legalization on strikes in Hong Kong is very strict, and therefore getting a permit can be extremely difficult, they've organized several demonstrations and have very clear requests to their government. Hong Kong signed the Paris Agreement but has also its own plan concerning global warming called 2030 Plus Action Plan, which states that Hong Kong should use renewable resources for about 3 or 4% of the total energy consumption by 2030. As Hong Kong's area is rather small, they lack water to produce hydraulic energy, and lack of land to put solar panels and wind turbines. The activists, however, believe that the government should at least double its percentage and consider employing solar power and biomass as a source of energy. Additionally, they asked to establish youth representatives in the steering committee on climate change to allow future generations who will be the most affected by climate change to have a voice in all decisions concerning the environment. Lastly, they asked to create a department within the Environmental Bureau charged with overseeing climate action, led by a climate action officer. This department should have and give climate crisis the attention it deserves and encourage the other climate initiatives.
This were the 20 Fridays for Future and School Strike for Climate demands around the world from us. To sum up, the most important things which we demand everywhere is that the countries meet the Paris Agreement. It is not something new, but something they did promise in the first place. But since nearly no country is meeting the agreement, it seems that we need to remind them what they risk of not doing anything. So we will continue striking and demanding the government to start acting now. This is all from the Youth Climate Podcast this week. We hope you have fun and that you'll learn some interesting new facts. Remember that the governments have the power to stop the climate crisis by making eco-friendly laws, and that, consequently, it is very important to strike to make our requests heard. Have a nice week, go striking every Friday, and see you next episode. Stay tuned!